Part of having a reconstruction portfolio that I hold is really about trying to grab this moment. It really is, I think, the biggest moment to reimagine Australia that we've had since the end of the Second World War. COVID has been, in many ways, a report card on Australian society, a whole lot of which has been great in terms of the way we've worked together as a community that we've seen throughout the pandemic, those in aged care and health. But it's also highlighted issues within our economy. We don't make things in Australia in the way that we used to. And if we're going to build back as a better country with a stronger economy, then we really need to be thinking about reconstruction in those terms. We need to be thinking about how we can make more things in Australia, how we can build a future made in Australia. It's why we've announced the National Reconstruction Fund as an example, which is there to try and see us climb the technological ladder in the industry that we build in this country. And I think in that sense it's also really important that we are looking across different areas of policy that we mightn't have connected before. I mean, we clearly have a skills crisis in Australia. Dealing with that is going to have a lot to do with how we deal with the question of employment. We need to be climbing the technological ladder. Turning science into jobs is fundamentally important in terms of how we conceive industry policy. And this government has been appalling at the commercialisation of science. Indeed, it's been appalling at the way in which it's handled science. So all of those are areas which need to be brought together through a lens of reconstruction, and that's what we're trying to do.
The government has just announced its own commercialisation, so I suppose it has a similar view. What then, though? I mean, you're talking about things that might take a while. What will be different in Australia in June if you're elected in May on COVID?
Oh, well, we're not pretending that in the space of a month matters can be turned around. But
I guess what I'm getting at, so there are no short-term changes you'd make to COVID response. You're talking about longer-term things.
Well, in terms of reconstruction, we are, but I'll tell you one thing that will change the day an Albanese Labor government is elected, and that is that you'll have a plan and a strategy, which is completely different to what we've got now. I mean, the Prime Minister announced his commercialisation policy a couple of days ago, but that comes off 9 years of neglect of both science and the production of publicly funded science and a complete ignoring of the whole question of commercialising that science. I mean, there's been no strategy brought to bear by this government at all. Indeed, there's been no plan throughout COVID-19. We'll have a plan from day one, and it's not going to happen overnight, but you'll have direction in this country, and you'll have a government which is actually going to take us forward to a better future.
But in terms of how we're handling COVID in the shorter term, which for a lot of people that's where they're looking right now, from May to June, you're not saying anything necessarily changes under Labor.
Well, I think that there are a whole lot of issues that we have seen right now in terms of the handling of COVID that has been completely inept on the part of the government. And we've made our criticisms in relation to that. I mean, one of the points that we make today is that, you know, for a lot of businesses and small businesses particularly, they are finding it as difficult to do business now as at almost any point during the pandemic, and yet the federal government has now bailed out in terms of providing any support at all. You've got both the Victorian and New South Wales governments putting forward support packages, but the federal government has gone absolutely missing, and that is a function of this government failing to plan. They failed to plan for this moment when the epidemic was going to be at its largest. They knew that months ago. They failed to plan in terms of having rapid antigen tests available. They failed to plan in terms of the vaccine rollout.
Okay.
Now, where the pandemic is at in May, you know, we need to get to that moment. But what you will see from an Albanese Labor government is a government which does plan, which does look ahead, and which does meet the challenges of the pandemic as we find them in May.
What about Labor's principles? So on the vaccine mandates, there have been some rolling protests here in Canberra. Let's take your home state of Victoria. You still can't get into a cafe, pub or restaurant if you're unvaccinated. Is that still the right approach, and will it always be the right approach?
Well, I think in the longer term we need to continually evaluate things. You know, right now that's the health advice, and I think state governments, in this case the Victorian government, have a right to put in place public health orders.
Is that the health advice? When we've heard Brett Sutton with recent evidence on things the Victorian government's been doing that wasn't his advice, such as stopping IVF. Do we know it's the official health advice to stop unvaccinated people even just getting into a cafe or a pub?
What's really important is that governments are listening to the health advice, and certainly that's what we would do if we were to form a government, is to have the health advice completely central to the decision making that we undertook. I think it is important to say that state governments, particularly in the absence of a federal government which is acting in this space, state governments have a right to put in place public health orders, and that it's really fundamentally important, obviously, that people are getting vaccinated, that they're getting double vaccinated, but also that they are then getting the booster.
I think just about everyone would agree with that, but this is the question that it comes down to. At what point do you say the people that have resisted vaccination are not going to change their minds? Let's not drive them into the hands of the hardcore anti-vaxxers. Let's not continue to divide society. Isn't that something we need to think about changing pretty soon in Victoria?
Well, I think the questions around vaccine mandates ultimately, I think, are questions which need to be considered in the context of the health advice, and that is also in turn a question then of making sure that we maximise the number of people who are vaccinated, and obviously to maximise the number of people who are getting their booster shot. They're the considerations that should be in place, and that's the basis on which governments should make their decisions.
All right, just finally, a lot of talk about texts. Let me ask you this: have you ever sent a disparaging text to a colleague about another one?
I don't believe I ever have sent a disparaging text. Certainly, I don't think so. Certainly not of the kind that we've seen. But I get that, texts, colourful texts, are probably a part of what is a colourful business in terms of politics. Look, for me, the issue when you're looking at this whole episode, and when you're looking at what's happening with Scott Morrison, is just the degree to which Scott Morrison sees every interaction, every relationship through the context of politics and often a political fight. I mean, he has been at war with the premiers really for most of the pandemic. He has failed to bring the country together in that sense, and I think Australia is more splintered now than at any point that I can remember, and that's really Scott Morrison's failure to bring people around the table and to actually work with them in a way which isn't completely overlaid by politics.
Richard Marles, thanks for your time today.
Thanks, Tom.